Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to the UC Center. We're here for the third installment of the California Leaders Speakers Series. This is its inaugural year. My name's Tom McMorrow. I'm a partner at Manat Phelps, and I chair the student program advisory board, along with some of the other board members in the audience today, who I'll try to recognize. It's an honor to be affiliated with this speaker series. It's been a vision for a long time, and it's finally come to fruition. Before we get underway, I do want to say thank you to the Student Center, which is the student arm of this. I don't know if Cindy or Dr. Kravitz are in the room, but that's what brought me to this 20 years ago, 15 years ago, sitting on the board, and that's an integral part of what the center does, is having students intern all across government. Which leads us to today's discussion. I got myself confused there. Which leads us to today's discussion to provide further insights into California's future and the leaders steering our state. Moderating the conversation is Pamela Wu, a two-time Emmy Award winner whose career spans the field of broadcast journalism, public relations, and communication. She is currently the Director of News and Media Relations for UC Davis Health. Previously, she led communications for UC Davis School of Law. Before joining UC Davis as a senior staffer, she was a news anchor and a reporter at Sacramento's KCRA Channel 3, as well as a substitute host on Capital Public Radio. So welcome, Pamela. Before I go further and introduce Betty, a friend, I want to recognize a few people in the audience. Russell Fong, Undersecretary of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, I understand, is here today. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Anna Bruin, there you go. A.G. Block, retired former director of the student program. A.G., are you in the room? Thank you. Jack Walco, another board member for the student program. I don't know if I'm missing anybody else. And Fran Mancia, former UC Regent. Now the big reason I'm here, it's to introduce a friend. I've known Betty a very long time. I've worked with her in a lot of capacities, and I'm thrilled to hear she's doing this. I'm also thrilled that she's a candidate for governor. It's one of those things where you can't lose if she's elected. Betty has dedicated her life, 40 years, in public service. She worked for Governor Davis as his budget director. She was chair of the State Board of Equalization. She was elected statewide as state controller, and as I mentioned, she's now running for governor. She currently is a College Futures Foundation board member, a CERES board member, and serves as vice chair of the California Democratic Party. Betty has committed herself to expanding economic opportunity for all Californians, advocating for immigrant families and making government more transparent and responsible, especially her work with balancing the budget of the fifth largest economy in the world. Not an easy achievement. A UC Berkeley alum, Betty Yee's continued leadership and contributions to the state of California cannot be overlooked. We are excited to hear from her about the state and what she has planned for her future and ours. Without any further delay, I'll hand it over to moderator Pamela.
Thank you so much, Thomas. As a UC alumna, as you heard, and a current staff member, I am so honored to take part in this conversation today. As you all know, this leadership speaker series aims to spotlight the future of California and its leadership and ignite really meaningful conversations about the state that we love and call home. These conversations are so timely as we're heading into a presidential election in which I think the two major candidates could not be more different. And we're also looking at an election for California governor in 2026. It'll be here before you know it. So to discuss the future of California, please join me once more in welcoming Betty to the table. Thank you. Seeing as we're at the UC Center, I think it's really appropriate to start with some questions about higher education. Great. Betty, you worked your way through college. You've had many positions as a public servant, as we just heard in your intro, and I'm sure you've witnessed very significant transformations in higher education policy. Could you please reflect on what you consider successes and what you consider to be continued challenges to ensure things like equitable access, affordability, and importantly, quality in higher education for all Californians?
Absolutely. Thank you, Pamela. It's always great to join you in conversation, and to Tom for the really wonderful, kind introduction. And thank you to the Center for the really kind invitation as well. You know, as a native Californian, I think it's fair to say that, you know, for many people today, you know, just the attainment of being able to consider post-secondary education is, you know, becoming less of a real possibility because of affordability, some access issues as well. But what I've seen change is this. You know, I went to Cal Berkeley. I did work my way through college. I worked part-time, had a number of jobs, and I remember the tuition was $212.50 a quarter.
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
$212.50 a quarter. And at that time, you could work and pay your way through school. And I did have some scholarships and financial aid. My parents grew up never thinking they would send their 6 children through school, and so this was something that was possible and attainable for me as I was graduating from high school. And I think that was the case for a very, very long time. And over time, what we saw was just really kind of a disinvestment in higher education, both from the federal government and state government. And when you see that, you begin to think about what does this mean in terms of just being able to build capacity for the future, certainly as we see demographic changes that have been so drastic here in California for the good. I do think diversity is our greatest strength here in California, but obviously meeting the needs of diverse learners is a challenge, and so we want to be sure that the university is flexible enough and higher education is flexible enough to do that. And so what we started to see was really you know, affordability and access, and then obviously equity become much more heightened in terms of, you know, just an experience in higher education here in California. And then also, I think the other change that I would say really, for me personally, that took a turn for higher education was Prop 209. This really was a setback for many of our underrepresented, underserved communities to be able to, you know, be admitted to higher education here in California and really bring that perspective of our diverse communities onto the campus. And when I think about, and we'll talk about a little bit, I think about the mission of higher education, but that to me was a game changer because all of a sudden it became a place where I think as a student and being very sensitive about, you know, being on campuses, certainly going back to campus as an alumna helping to raise money for scholarships, it really became a front and center issue about how do we really have that diversity reflected so that the university really is accomplishing its mission with respect to understanding social change around us, understanding the future of our economy, understanding the different perspectives that our diverse communities are really helping to inform the future of California. And so to me, that was a huge, huge game changer. And I hope that we continue to look at just how we address issues of equity in all the ways that we have available to us. And particularly as we think about the high costs of post-secondary education, I think there are ways that we can really focus on how we center learners more so that they are incorporated into this community.
Education, of course, in so many ways contributes to the shaping of California's future. How do you see higher education playing a role in the future of California's workforce, especially considering that our labor markets are very technology heavy, very automation heavy these days?
Absolutely. You know, one of the things that I think it's not a fault, but it is, I think, just an attribute of systems when you think about just huge institutions like, well, take, for example, the University of California. Just the ability to be nimble and to change and to adapt to, you know, current conditions takes a long time. And so I do think that what we need to do with respect to the role of higher education is, and particularly as it relates to workforce, because we're seeing how work is changing in front of us in very, very drastic ways. Obviously, the pandemic informed us in terms of different ways to work, but to your point, Pamela, about technology and innovation, this is going to be a game changer, and it already is. You know, here we're home to technology and innovation here in California, but at the same time, and I'll just use an example, I do think that all of our educational institutions from K-12 all the way through higher education have a role to play in terms of being sure that we are providing just a basic fundamental and foundational level of technology literacy for all Californians. And this is something that I know will be required for any job in the future. And then also the way that we are working now. I think for workers who have enjoyed a 15, 20, 30, 40-year career, I think those are jobs that really are of the past. Workers are going to be working dozens of jobs over the course of their lifetime. So how do we look at really building that worker resilience from a skills standpoint and also from an earnings standpoint? And I think, to me, those are the two issues about higher education and the economy and the future of our workforce that really can be married in a way where if we are able to be more nimble about preparing for those needs, we can really see really incorporating every Californian in that vision.
We are, of course, at the UC Student Policy Center, emphasis on the word student. I see so many shining student faces in the audience today, and many of them are doing internships around government and other public service. How do you see higher education and the next generation coming out of UC as playing and maintaining a role in having an informed electorate?
Great question. And it's not just the students, but obviously the students are very, very important. I think all of us are students when it comes to, just being part of an informed electorate. But certainly higher education has a huge role to play from the perspective that it really is at the juncture of everything that relates to change happening around us, right? And so I think for how we prepare for just all the changes that are happening around us, whether they're local, national, global, higher education has a significant role to play. But I'm going to take this back to a more fundamental level, and that is, just the role of education generally. That really what education is, yes, it is to help us prepare for our future with respect to skills development and hopefully getting that good job and being able to be viable and successful and for our own self. But it's also a bigger mission. And this is one of the things I will call out the University of California for. There's this calling that it's also about, how we can be just situated to be almost an agent in society with respect to how we incorporate, how we look at influencing social change. And one of the things about education that I think, and particularly with all the attacks on public education today that we're reading about in the news, is that, and I understand the attack because it's so fundamental to our democracy. When you think about the role of education and how it is to really help us develop discerning minds, helps us develop a sense of really understanding what our interests are, understanding those who may be working and consistent with our interests, and certainly understanding those who may not be. And so when we are part of the electorate, we go and make these choices about issues, about candidates, and one of the things about technology and innovation, unfortunately, is that there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation. So how do you distill that? How do you distill that? And I think all of the experiences of higher education, the critical thinking, the analysis, really understanding how media operates, mainstream and otherwise, looking at just how communities are a part of that or are not a part of that, who's telling our stories, who's really out there, pushing for different interests. All of that is about really developing our own discernment about what's happening in the world and in our lives. And so I think this is much beyond just the students. It starts there, but it's really for society as a whole.
I love that you raised that point. There is so much disinformation out there, and those of you who are very, very young, compared to me, because I'm old, right? Have grown up in this environment where there is so much disinformation, which is intentional, right? Misinformation as well. And so it would seem that the duties and responsibilities of higher education then to train folks in critical thinking is more important than ever.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we do, and I do want to say that I think the institutions are really doing a good job. And, to invite, just in terms of what's been happening on campuses recently with the, war in Israel and Gaza. And, this is not meant to be a political statement by any means, but, when you look at how different campuses dealt with the protests, I would say that, where else but on campus can you really hope for, and I hope for, liberalism to continue to be alive and well? That there are different perspectives and different, points of view, and that they can be expressed and be respected. And I think one of the demise of our democracy is that when we don't make room for that. And that it's really then all of a sudden outsized interests having a bigger voice than anyone else. And so, but I think this is really the crux of what's going to be needed going forward even more so, because with technology, I mean, it is very, very difficult. And particularly, I'm thinking about this election cycle because you talk about the two
Yeah.
candidates.
Yeah.
And I mean, you remember in 2016 when we had the election, the president who got elected, I knew nothing about where he stood on issues, but we certainly knew about him as a personality. Right, and so you know, and I think media did a great job of just introducing him as a personality. But when it came to really discerning, like, what does he stand for, we came to find out obviously during his administration. But I hope that we can all be just much more discerning this cycle.
Yes, well, and focused on the issues
Yes.
too, right? As someone who has worked in journalism on the
Absolutely.
inside covering politics, I can tell you that there has been a great deal of focus on sort of like the gamesmanship
Right.
and the horse race. We do like to see more about the issues. So hoping for really great election coverage coming this
I do
year.
too.
Indeed. Reflecting on your tenure as a former state budget director and, of course, state controller, what do you think California does well in terms of how it manages its money?
Okay. I think what California does well is really try to encourage a diverse economy. And I think the diversity of our economy is really what has helped us weather, just so many of our budget challenges over the decades. And you obviously have sectors of the economy that are very sensitive to the condition of what's happening here and around the world. But just to continue to encourage, just different industry sectors to be here, to look at how we have old industries, we have new industries, but California still is attractive to so many people around the world to come here and to just continue to innovate. So I do think encouraging innovation has continued to be a hallmark. What I do think has been missing in terms of just our budget is looking at how we can be smarter about our resources. I'm in finance, and so my mantra, actually, my husband's here, so he knows this at home too, and that is, we are living with finite resources. We're living with finite resources. And why I say that is because we're going to come to a point where we can't tax people anymore. We're going to come to without any, kind of really adverse consequences. We have finite fiscal resources that are being really taxed now. Our natural resources are being, really put under strain. And so when I think about, just what is our pot of gold here in California, it's all of us. It's the resource of our people. And so we have to be really, I think, much more daring and bold about how we work in an era of finite resources so that we can actually be compelled to think more innovatively and think about just different ways of how we are going to accomplish our goals. And it's really one of the reasons why I think with this mindset, because if we're just stuck with thinking that, oh yes, we're always going to have resources, or maybe not this year, but next year we're going to have it again, we're never that future-oriented to where we are protecting ourselves from what will be unintended shocks coming in the future. And just take, for example, climate change. Climate change. There is no issue that you can tackle in California without thinking about the implications of climate change. Housing, transportation, what we do with our natural lands, how we even build our schools, for the future. All of this really has to take that into account. And if you don't do that, and particularly with climate change, every part of the state now knows what that feels like. So we're either going to pay now or pay later with respect to the consequences. So, but being smarter about it, where we integrate, and this is a way where we might be able to integrate streams of funding to actually get better outcomes relative to all of those issues if we think about them as being interrelated.
I want to make sure I quote you correctly to my 13-year-old. We are living with finite resources.
Right, exactly.
We are living with finite resources. Okay, parents, write that down. You mentioned climate change. What should our state's role be in fighting climate change?
I always look at climate change as one of those issues where, obviously, one that is just fraught with a lot of peril and great risk, but also one that presents a lot of opportunities. And as I think about just, and one of those issues where you really do get the feel for things that you can do short term to just mitigate some of the impacts, but certainly long term, we have to think about, what do we want our communities and planet to look like? And so as I think about climate change, I think a lot about the most burdened communities who really have had to live with a lot of the policies that we've had in place so far that haven't necessarily made their lives better, but have really had to live with the burdens of the policies. And let me just talk about that for a moment. Oftentimes when we think about whether we're making progress in California, we have a very narrow lens through which we make that assessment. And we aren't necessarily, in the communities that have the most dire, conditions of living. And I travel the state quite extensively, and so I know that, for example, up in the North State, in the Central Valley, in so many parts of the state where air quality is bad, continues to be bad, chronic health conditions as a result really are quite prevalent. And then looking at where there are future economic opportunities in these areas. I mean, these are places that generally get exploited with respect to economic opportunities, not where we are allowing these communities to determine their own resilience for the long term. And so as I think about this, it's really takes in all the issues of equity, takes in all the issues of environmental justice, it takes in all these issues in terms of what do we want to build for the future of California that actually have these frontline communities at the table talking about how they can build their own resilience. That is an investment worth making, because when we keep shifting the burdens to where these communities continually have to live with the consequences of the policies that we have made by virtue of disinvestment, we're never going to get there.
What are some steps that you think California could take to make government, the legislative process, the budget process more transparent and more accountable to your everyday Californians?
This is where I have to pay homage to one of my political mentors who passed away recently, and that is the late Assembly member and Mayor of Sacramento, Phil Eisenberg, who was a political mentor of mine. When I got started as a staff in the building, I see so many colleagues of mine from over the decades here today. We remember a time when budget hearings meant something. We remember a time when, from year to year, we would put departments and agencies under scrutiny about what happened to that dollar that we gave you last year. Did you fill those positions? What are the program outcomes? And what Phil used to always tell me was, and he would be critical of bills that I would often try to advance, and he said, well, how are we going to measure success? How are we going to measure success? Or is it just going to be because we have to be responsive to a particular issue, we're just going to put more money into it? And this is where I actually think, and I'm hopeful that with this budget deficit that the legislature has faced this year, it will not go away next year, that we can have a reset back to just the discipline of having much more transparency and accountability with respect to the budget process itself. And this is what's going to serve the public. Mm-hmm. I mean, there is not a lot written about the budget except when there's an agreement. But frankly, in terms of how it affects people's lives, and we're already curtailing, I think, a lot of public comment in the process to where we don't even know necessarily. And so I think there is so much work to do here. It is a big cornerstone of what I want to, hopefully continue to uplift, because when people don't know and when people don't really have the ability to participate, they oftentimes are the ones that are left behind. And so we definitely need much more transparency in the process. The other way I would say, is just when we are looking at the numbers. So the budget is not a mystery. It actually, well, for me, it's not a mystery. It's a puzzle. So, but for the students who are in the room, I'm just going to say one thing. Regardless of what you do in your career, just get some fiscal experience under your belt. It will serve you well anywhere. Because it drives almost every other decision that will affect you and your business or company. So this is a time where there is such distrust in government, and I just feel like this process has every ability to elevate the public's trust and confidence in their government. By really welcoming, just the input of our communities here in California. I remember when I was budget director for Gray Davis, and we used to, when we had a surplus, we had given quite a bit of additional funding to K-12 education. But there was always this sense that we didn't trust school districts in terms of how they were going to spend that money. So strings attached to almost every pot of money. So no surprise, the next year we come back to the budget, some of that money hadn't been spent. Well, who are we to know, sitting here in Sacramento, what's in the best interests of a school up in, Shasta County, or a school down in Riverside County? We don't. And so I think this is also about how we can be better partners with our local governments and school districts so that we're also looking for better accountability from them as they are looking to deploy our dollars in the best way possible for the best outcomes. So it's there's just a whole major reset, Pamela, that I think really has to be done that I think has the great ability of elevating the public's trust and confidence in their government.
I want to ask a follow-up question about what I guess you sort of referred to as like the Eisenberg way,
Yes,
right?
right.
And how there was a lot more comment before. We have a lot of students in this room
Yes.
who are so young, they don't remember what that looked like. Can you
Sure.
paint the picture for them?
course.
Like, what did that look like?
Of course, yes. So the budget process, many of you know, the governor introduces a budget on January 10th of every year, or by January 10th of every year. And really, the legislature, after that time, begins to look at how to shape it according to their priorities. And so they will have their budget subcommittees in both houses begin to hold hearings. And oftentimes, they won't make a decision right away, but they want to get a briefing and just an update on what the departments and agencies are doing. And, but those hearings are open. Any member of the public can come in. If you're affected by a program within the Department of Healthcare Services, if you're affected by, I mean, my mom's 101 years old. If you're affected by a skilled nursing facility that maybe wasn't inspected for, 4 or 5 years. I mean, these are things that the member of the public can actually come in and testify about. I would say that probably a good time after term limits, a lot of that public comment was curtailed. It's now time limited. I mean, who wants to come up and make a public comment when your time is limited to 2 minutes? I mean, really. And maybe during the pandemic it helped when we were online so that people could call in, and but it's nothing like being able to be right there in front of your decision makers. So once we had public comment, the subcommittees would make a recommendation to the full budget committee. And back in the day, there used to be a version of the budget that was introduced in the Senate and a version that was introduced in the Assembly. And then when both houses would vote on their versions of the budget, there would be what would be called a conference committee that would be formed with representatives from both houses of the legislature, bipartisan, that would basically work out the differences for each line item that had a difference between the two houses to finally get a final budget agreement. And then it was not unusual for the what we call the Big Five leaders, so the governor, the Speaker of the Assembly, the Senate President Pro Tem, as well as the minority leaders of each house to come together and actually negotiate on some of the larger items in the budget. And then that would be brought back to the committee for a hearing, and there would also be testimony. So it was very, very open. The process was very open. It was never also a process, which, by the way, today makes it even less accessible to the public, and that is major policies are being enacted in the budget. In the budget, not in legislation that moves through the process, but in the budget. So these budget trailer bills were initially meant to implement the budget. If you needed a law change to be able to make that cut in social services, then we would have that in a budget trailer bill. Not major wholesale bills where you're enacting a managed care organization tax that would fund the rest of Medi-Cal provider rates or anything major like that. Obviously, that's a budget issue, but that should get a more full airing in terms of a public hearing.
We'd like to see that come back in some way.
Come back. And I know it is a lot of time. It's a huge commitment of time. These hearings do go on forever. But, if you don't respect that this is a process that is a public process, it is the people's capital, and really every decision that's made in the budget affects so many lives in California. This is what we need to keep in mind, and I hope we can get back to that point.
Let's talk about affordability. It remains a top concern for Californians. I mean, probably the top concern. Housing is so expensive these days, not just for buyers, but even for renters.
Yes.
What is your vision for how California can address its affordability crisis?
It is the number one issue, and frankly, it has really huge implications for our economy. I know I was asked earlier by someone, what about companies leaving the state? We're such a high tax state. I said, no, we're a high housing cost state. That's why they're leaving. They can't figure out where their workforce is going to live. They don't know how talent is going to be able to stay here. And I wish for all of you who are here and want to make California your home, I want you to be able to stay here. We're going to hemorrhage talent if we don't take care of the housing affordability crisis. It's a crisis because we don't have enough supply. I mean, that's bottom line. The homelessness crisis is growing because we don't have enough supply. Yes, there are all the other kind of attendant issues for what happens when you become housing insecure. But fundamentally, we don't have enough housing supply. And when we do have it, to your point, Pamela, how do we keep that supply affordable?
Right.
Right. Over half of Californians rent, so even multifamily housing and rental housing is not being put online enough. There are a couple things that I think could make a difference. One is I don't think there's any other industry aside from housing construction that I can think of, maybe a few, where the time value of money is so stark. I mean, and so I think for California as a state that has almost 8 different affordable housing financing programs, just being smarter about how we make those allocations from those programs. This is going to be very wonky and bureaucratic, but I actually sponsored a bill for 2 years in a row, try to pull all of those programs under one allocation committee so we can see just the broad public benefit that any development project was going to provide for California in reducing our housing crisis. And I sat on 2 of those committees to allocate tax credits as well as bond dollars, and when we just see a sliver of the financing for a project, it doesn't tell me anything. And so it's a system that frankly can be gamed and has been, but if we're able to actually pull it all under one allocation committee just to see for one particular project, like where all the funding is going to come from, and really even accelerate the time that it would take to break ground on those projects, that could be really a game changer. We still have so many more millions of units to build, so it's a program that I hope can be adopted by the legislature at some point. The second thing is just looking at what I think was a really big development relative to one of the biggest sources of capital for affordable housing, and that is redevelopment. I love Governor Brown, who's a great governor, but when he dissolved redevelopment, it was no surprise. We knew that the set-aside, so redevelopment is the growth on property taxes, called the property tax increment, that used to be collected at the county level and then reallocated back to where that increment was generated. And of that, 20% was set aside for low and moderate income housing. And usually was really the piece that kind of was the catalyst for how other financing sources would come together for a project. When that went away, and I have to laugh because Governor Brown actually took way advantage of redevelopment when he was mayor of Oakland, built a ton of affordable housing, and then dissolved it for nobody else to use. So, but I do want to bring that back because I do think it is a way that if you have that capital and have that financing, there are lots of ways that we can be more innovative about where we build housing. You can actually do adaptive reuse. You can do mixed use. You can do go to blighted areas. Without expanding footprints where your NIMBYism is live and well. There are many, many parts of California where we know that we have sites where affordable housing can be developed, and we hope that redevelopment can be a part of that. But also using a portion of that increment. It was a 20% set aside. Maybe we have a higher set aside so that we can use a part of that just to be sure that we are buying the sustainability of affordability of the units that we're building over the long term.
I just observed that you really light up when you talk about fixing things.
I do.
Yeah, you do. California, as you well know, is the 5th largest economy in the world and a leader in so many sectors: tech, healthcare, agriculture, clean energy. And this is not just nationally, but internationally as well. How does California maintain its leadership moving into the future?
The leadership that we need to maintain is right here in the room. It's really building that workforce. It's keeping that talent here. It's looking at how we continue to be innovative. This is what the rest of the world looks to us for. And I hope we can also just get a handle on our immigration policies as well. I know the state of California has little leverage with respect to that, but certainly from the federal government perspective, a huge, huge influence in terms of our workforce policy here in California. But it is, I'll say this about California. Even though we're a global economy, I think sometimes we don't act like it. We don't allow ourselves to be that daring and now that bold, but it is one where I think we have to really look at how we can also look at innovations in other countries that may be further ahead of us. We don't know all the answers, but we definitely have the talent that can put those answers into play. So definitely the human development and human talent piece of it is very, very critical. Secondly, continuing to invest in our education system. This is critical. When we look at really fundamentally how we're going to continue to meet our workforce needs that are so integral to how we develop new sectors in the economy, our renewable energy economy. This is going to be very, very key. I'll just give you an example. I happened to be in Northern Ireland last fall, and what I thought was just a beautiful model. And it used to be here at a greater scale. But in Northern Ireland, with even an unstable government, has been really at the forefront of the sustainability economy. It's fascinating. But what happens there is that they have very, very close relationships between the companies, their government, and their universities. So your R&D right there at your universities with your PhDs there who then become the CEO of the startups, who then go back to the university to do the skills development of what they need in terms of their workforce. And it's a beautiful thing. And I hope that we can kind of get into this mindset of where it's not a one and done in terms of what we do with our human talent, but that there are just so many opportunities. And the other piece I will throw in there, because we haven't talked about this, but I do think really, really critical for many of our BIPOC communities, and that is there are so many entrepreneurial opportunities as well. And so I hope that we can also just put more of a focus on, just how we can grow businesses here in California, both small, medium, and have that be also the way that we are bringing innovations to market and how we're actually getting them deployed throughout all of California.
Are you ready for some questions from our very bright students?
Of course.
Okay, let's begin with Alina Susu from UCLA. Alina, hi. We have a microphone for
great.
you, and we're going to come to you.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you so much for your time today and your insight.
I don't think it's on. It may not have been on when it was handed to you. It's just a
There you
switch
go.
that flips up.
Thank you.
Okay. Like I was saying, thank you so much for your time and your insightful answers today. You kind of touched upon this, but my question to you is, what do you think is the biggest problem plaguing California today, and how do you intend to address it?
Thank you for the question, Alina. This may come as a surprise, but it's something that I haven't mentioned yet.
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to say housing.
No, it is definitely an issue. I actually think one of the biggest challenges right now, and this has been since I left office 18 months ago, I've been traveling the state, meeting with leaders all throughout the state, and also being in different communities around the state. And what I would say is a challenge, and why I say it's a challenge is because I'm not sure that of all the issues that we've touched on today that Pamela has engaged on, with me about, that even the best of policies can have any impact if we don't address this one issue, and that is how so many of us are really walking around today with some degree of unaddressed trauma. And I raise that because I have seen it in the most starkest forms around the state, and I know I carry it. And I carry it just with the, at a very micro level of just not knowing that there's going to be certainty tomorrow. Every day there's just like new things kind of, coming in to our lives sideways. And I think that creates a bit of anxiety. And for a lot of Californians, they're carrying a lot of that anxiety. Much of it, yes, pandemic induced and pandemic influence, but it also is about just all the issues that we talked about with how Californians are really questioning whether this can be a place that they can call home for the long term. So, and then all the way up to, I would say, at a macro level, being a descendant of generations of a community that have been oppressed. Don't forget our history, the history of our country is really based on, the oppression of others. And so we're seeing some of that come to the surface with the discussion around reparations for our Black community. And, but it goes deeper than that, so many promises that have been made to different communities and yet really underdelivered. And when that happens, and frankly, I go to communities around California where I don't know how they wake up every day with an ounce of hope, but they do. And that's what gives me hope, is that they have the resilience and the grit. And so when those ingredients are there, I know that there are many good things that we can do just with a modest investment, just understanding that they're part of our greater fabric of our state. So, and of course, why I'm really pointing this out is because we have such a shortage of mental health and behavioral health practitioners today. And this is something that I hope we can all lean into and really understand. Again, it's not a one-size-fits-all in terms of how we respond to this. We do need to develop that pipeline of professionals, but it's also very, very different from a cultural competency standpoint, from a generational standpoint. But I hope that we can get ahead of just really providing a safe place here in California where we can lead and know that anyone who is carrying any unaddressed trauma has the ability to, really seek the assistance that they need to work through that.
Thank you so much.
Alina, thank you for your question. We have another question from a student, Matthew Rowe from UC Berkeley,
All right. Go Bears.
right?
Yeah, thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure watching this talk. What has been the biggest accomplishment of your career and why?
Okay. Biggest accomplishment of my career. Several. I'm going to talk about the first bill I had signed that I worked on. It was back in 1988. I was a Senate fellow for now retired Congresswoman Diane Watson and former ambassador as well. And I remember coming up here to Sacramento as a Senate fellow because I was a county public health commissioner and really trying to deal with the HIV/AIDS crisis and wanting to bring some additional public health dollars back to the counties to do our education and outreach. We didn't know anything about treatment at that point, but we knew where the high-risk communities were, so just getting some additional dollars for that. And in that process, certainly what I saw, I was a public health commissioner in Santa Cruz County. And what I brought with me to that experience was just seeing how so many people were not being served, just even with respect to education and outreach, because they were suffering from both mental illness and substance abuse. And so the bill that I introduced on behalf of the senator, and which she allowed me to carry, and to this day I remember the conversation I had with former Governor George Deukmejian, Republican governor, but very open to this, was essentially to allow the blending of funding for state funds being used to treat substance abuse and for mental illness, because we were trying to treat the whole person. And oftentimes, how people got treated with their conditions really was predicated on the available funding and what the funding streams and the criteria were for spending that money, which just was such a barrier in terms of people who are living with a dual diagnosis. So I was explaining this to Governor Deukmejian, and he was so listening intently. He said, "So what do we have to do?" And I said, "Just take the rules away, allow us to blend the funding. If a person has both, have both mental illness and substance abuse, the practitioners need to be able to avail themselves of the full funding." And so we signed the bill. And to this day, we had not ever heard of dual diagnosis, up until that point, and now it is unfortunately a pretty good sized population of those who are unsheltered today. So I'm really proud of that work that we did early on in the 80s.
Thank you, Matthew, for your question. You were young when you became public health commissioner, weren't you?
I was in my late 20s. Yes.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
We have a little bit of time left to take some open questions
Yes,
from
please.
the audience. And so if you have a question for former State Controller Yee, please raise your hand and we'll bring a mic to you.
All right. One in the back and then front.
Yeah, one in the back and one in the front. Hi, please stand and introduce yourself and share your question.
Hi, my name is Brianna. I'm from UC Santa Cruz. I have just a quick question. By the way, thank you for your time and sharing with us your thoughts. I wanted to know about right now the upcoming budget cuts that there's going to be for education funds for UC and Cal state universities throughout the state. My question for you is, what would you advise for students who are relying a lot on financial aid or scholarships to
Yes.
prepare for the next upcoming year?
Right. No, thank you. This is one of the unfortunately difficult parts of the budget structure that we have here in California. There's very little discretion in our state budget. The first calls on any of our general fund goes to debt service, goes to contributions to our public pension funds. and some other calls that are in our Constitution and in statute. And so really when you look at discretionary funding, that is the rest of the budget for higher education, for our correctional system, for some of our social services and general government. It's a very, very small percentage. And so those are, kind of the competitors, if you will, against the funds for higher education. Every year I get still a call when the budget is released, or even before the budget is released, wanting my crystal ball, kind of guess about what the budget's going to look like. And then inevitably the question, well, how do you think our program would get more funding? And my response in the past few years has been this. I think we have to really discipline ourselves to look beyond just higher education. Higher education has a role in so many aspects of California, and particularly some of the issues that we've just talked about, Pamela and I have talked about. I mean, I think about climate change. I mean, how the heck are we going to look at really addressing the needs of climate change? This is where, yes, it's workforce, but yes, it's also innovation. But it's looking at other sources of funding besides the typical way of funding our higher education systems. Back in the 60s, particularly the University of California, it was a prominent recipient of federal research funds. And I really would like to see us get back to that role, because not only is research going to be critical in terms of how we are going to solve many of these challenges that we're going to be facing, but it has to be accelerated. And I hope that, just even in terms of some of the federal funds that are being made available, whether it's the infrastructure funds or the climate funding, the CHIPS Act funding, that there's a way that the university can really look at, leveraging some of those dollars. And so I think just thinking outside the box about other funding sources, but how do we then really integrate those sources in a way where we're getting, much more opportunities in terms of bringing the student experience to be one that can involve more students, and also have them be exposed to just the issues that we're going to need to really face front and center.
Thank you very much for your question. And we had a question from a student up in front as well. Hi, please tell us your name and where you go to school.
Hi, I'm Emily. I go to UC Santa Barbara. And one thing that I felt, first, thank you for your nice speech back and or your conversation back and forth. But my question was, you talked a lot about like burden communities and kind of this underrepresentation of communities in our government and conversations and public comment, things like that. I was wondering how you feel like we could create an environment where we're integrating these communities who largely feel, untrusted by with the current government and kind of out of the loop. Like, how do we bring these communities in and make them feel comfortable and understood and represented?
That's a great question, and I love the question because it really relates to so many things that we've touched on in terms of what's happening today, right? At the most fundamental level, democracy, right? We hear a lot about how our democracy is under threat, and yet to me, what the most fundamental antidote is to engage, be sure everyone's engaged. And so a personal commitment of mine since I've been in public office, and it's more so now, is really looking at how we really elevate civic education. And I'm going to say this in a way that hopefully makes sense. There's been a lot of just, back and forth with, many in my generation who say, oh yeah, people aren't taking civics anymore. They just don't have a view about, politics and policy and the role of government in their lives. And so, the discourse has just been, going downhill. We are at that point, and you hear this a lot, where we need to meet people where they are. And I believe that. Because people's lives are very stressed right now. It is also where civic education is happening every single day in our communities on the ground. And so what I would suggest is not civics, but civic education, getting out of our bubble, doesn't happen in a classroom. It happens in our communities. And how we then hook up our anchor institutions to what's happening in our communities. I've been really fortunate to experience in the last few months so many great sustainability initiatives that are happening on the ground in Los Angeles. You never hear about them. But the NGOs down there are doing a phenomenal job of really recruiting young people from the university and colleges down there, as well as high school students, to talk about and tackling sustainability issues in their own communities. And this is where I think all of us need to make room for that. I think as the state of California, we need to incorporate just so much of what is learned on the ground into our decision-making process. And so really trusting that what's happening on the ground is really going to have impact when we pay attention to what we can do to make investments in those communities. So it's not, I don't think the assumption can be that we just invite these communities to the table. Many of them don't have the wherewithal to be at the table. So we need to be able to receive an invitation to be at their table, and to then understand that these are trusted sources with lived experiences that we can count on in terms of making decisions about how we deploy our resources and how we look at planning for the future.
Thank you for your question. We have a little bit of time if anybody has one final question they'd like to ask. Don't be shy. A real opportunity here to ask questions. Oh, we have, I didn't see it. Where did you see that, Betty? Oh, hand up right there. Perfect.
Yeah, there's two.
Oh, there's two. Okay. Lightning round.
All right.
You talked about California being business
Tell us
friendly.
your name and where
My
you go
name
to
is
school.
Ian Olson. I'm a local professional here.
Hi, Ian.
How do you view ways California can be more business friendly and encourage entrepreneurship?
Yes, thank you. I've been having this conversation, believe it or not, with my 101-year-old mother, who has been reminiscing about the time when she and my father had their laundry and dry cleaning business in San Francisco. And she oftentimes says to me, we could not have had that business today and raised 6 children. The high cost of doing business, but more importantly, just the regulatory environment. And they ran a safe laundry and dry cleaners. I don't remember chemicals being around, and it was fine. We all worked hard in that family business. But I think about particularly the regulatory environment, and this has been part of the conversations I've been having with business leaders around the state. When we are reactive and responsive to issues and not thinking about the long term, oftentimes we will put policies in place that is exactly that, has a short-term impact, but not understanding that those who actually have to comply with the new law or the new regulation has to incorporate it into their business model. And that may not be the only regulation that they have to incorporate. And so when I look at, I wouldn't say it's regulatory reform, but I would be very interested in the thorough regulatory review that, by the way, our state agencies and departments can do because they're the experts to see where we have overlapping duplicative requirements. These are mandates that many of our businesses are living with today. And many of them just feel like this is what's going to cause them to go under. They understand taxes because it is the costs of the privilege of doing business here in California. They want certainty with respect to our tax system. But when it comes to the regulatory environment, they feel that that is much more arbitrary. And particularly when it's layer upon layer of mandates that they have to comply with. I want to just speak about a meeting that I had recently in the Central Valley with a number of agricultural leaders, both big and small agriculture. And they want to be the sustainability leaders in agriculture. And they have incentives to do so under the Biden climate policies. And yet when California continues to look at putting different mandates on them, they're just trying to survive. They want more time. They want more rationality in terms of how to really comply with these mandates. And they don't feel like they're getting a welcome mat to be able to have these conversations. We rely on them. We shouldn't be offering a welcome mat. They're feeding the rest of the nation and the world. And yet, if they go under, I shudder to think what happens to those economies in the Valley and in other of the neighboring jurisdictions. So this is one area where I think doing business in California, people, yes, mostly are leaving because of the high cost of housing. But I think they're also fed up that so much of what they are just trying to do in terms of building a business, they've put their stake in the ground, they're willing to make the investments. The upfront costs are much greater now to be able to even begin a business. And yet once you're in business, what you have to comply with on an ongoing basis is definitely much more of a cost.
Thanks, Ian, for your question. And was there one more that I missed? Did someone else have their hand up already?
Back on the side.
Okay, I'm not seeing it past this
pillar?
This
Yeah.
pillar.
Okay.
We've both got blind spots. Hi, please
Hi.
introduce yourself.
Why don't you-
Hi, my name is Emmanuel Sanchez. I'm a future student of UC Santa Cruz.
Great.
My question to you is, how can California students now and in the future thrive independently from surviving in a renter's economy?
Yeah. It is, well, one, help us advocate to build more housing. I mean, I think this is really what's going to be needed. I mean, we don't have enough supply. And we also have policies that I'll just say this. From my perspective, the legislature in the past couple of years have really added to the kinds of options that can help with building all different kinds of housing supply. I think we need to stop. Just need to stop with the bills and just look at how we accelerate the construction of housing and how we look at really maintaining the affordability of housing. And with that, I think just looking at the tools that we have that we can do that with, the financing tools, certainly our relationship with our local governments that make all of the development decisions, and as well as looking at what I hope can be a bigger conversation about housing, because this involves all of you. We always talk about the number of units that we need to build, these regional housing assessment goals that are unrealistic for some regions because they just don't have the footprint, frankly, to be able to build to the population that's there for future needs. But what we really should be talking about when we build housing is, what do we want our communities to look like? What kind of communities do we want to build for the future? Because that then incorporates who's in those communities now. We have an aging population in California. Most people who are aging here in California want to age in place. They want to stay in their homes. What does that look like in terms of communities? Where do young people live where we can continue to attract the talent that then brings economic opportunities where people want to do business development here in California? And so we're not really having that holistic conversation. And I think if we did that, we would see that housing options can really be much more varied because it's a piece of what we have to do. And then with respect to what the state can do, we can be better partners with our local governments in terms of sharing some of that responsibility for what we want communities to look like. Maybe a better partner in terms of infrastructure financing. Maybe a better partner in terms of business development incentives. Maybe a better partner in terms of the schools that need to be sited, near where our emerging communities are coming to live. All these things also, by the way, play into this whole debate on public safety that is going on right now. Public safety and what is going on right now in the legislature is very much an economic issue. And if we're not talking about it in that way, if we're not having this more holistic conversation about what we want our future communities to look like, where each of you have a say in that, we are missing a huge opportunity in terms of building a California where people can really hope to stay here and call it home and know that they and their families can thrive, including all of you here.
Thank you for your question. In our last couple of minutes, I didn't miss anyone, right? Didn't miss anyone, because I got this big pillar here, so I just want to make sure.
I got one here.
Yeah, right, and then you've got one here. So I'll ask you, just as our last question to wrap things up, we've had a very wide-ranging talk today. For our audience members, when they leave here today, if they remember just one thing, what do you want that main takeaway to be?
Okay. I think the main takeaway for all of us is looking at, look, we're here in California. I think we all share a love of the state, right? And I hope that when we think about the future of the state, that each of us will do what we can to be sure that we can fulfill a vision of where each of us can really see ourselves thriving, and here and along with our families and loved ones. It's a beautiful state. I grew up here, and it was a different era, of course. But one of the things that I felt like we had when I was growing up, and I'm going to end with this because and I apologize for bringing my mother up a lot, but she is my anchor. And frankly, the experience that she and my father had, I think, is so indicative of what so many Californians are experiencing today. My mother was always the risk taker between my father and my mother. And I remember arguments they would have about money. When I was younger, laundry and dry cleaning business, I kept the books for them, and they would always argue about money. When we started to be able to save a little bit, my mother said to my father, "Why don't we look at, buying a place, not paying rent anymore for, our business or our businesses?" And my father instantly just shut down that idea. Well, what if I can't make the mortgage one month? They're just going to take it all away from us, and then we'd have to start, from below ground zero. And my mother said, "Well, I'll just go out and get a job." And we talk about this today because she's just remembering a lot about, my father, who's been deceased for almost 40 years. And she said to me, people can't do that anymore. They're already working 2 or 3 jobs. But all to say, we remember a time in California when we were so future-oriented to where there were always supports there. If any Californian was going to experience any kind of vulnerability, and whether it was financial, there was cash assistance. Whether it was a setback in their jobs, there was always skills training. You know, whether it was, just, not being able to afford to, provide payroll for your employees. Banks actually used to do cash flow loans. You can't even do those anymore. Those kinds of things just aren't available anymore. And I think as we think about the future and knowing that we're going to be facing a lot of vulnerability, like how about if government actually looks at how we can provide more flexible capacity so when these needs come up, we can pivot in a very, very short time and be able to meet, these needs. And we know what they are. We know what they are. I mean, for all of you who are here, you're experiencing it now. Whether it's tuition that you're paying, that's a financial burden, I think, for many. Whether it's looking at how you're even going to be part of the housing market here in California, that's another piece of it. If you decide that you're going to be here and actually start a family, another place where you might be needing to a helping hand. All of these things we felt like there were always backstops that government could provide. And we don't have that here today. And I think all of you informing that going forward and helping us rebuild that capacity again can really be so helpful in terms of how we can see ourselves just being viable and knowing that this can help us build resilience for the long term as well. So just use your voice and really talk about what that looks like for you. And I think it's a common vision that I think all of us can get behind in terms of just being sure that California can add up for all of us again.
Betty Yee, thank you for sharing with us today and for your service to our state. Betty Yee, everyone.